I never asked why she wore her hair in that single thick braid instead of the two most of the women from her camp favored. Looking back, that was the first thing I noticed about her and the last thing I ever asked. And somewhere between those two facts is most of what I have to tell. She came to my trading post the first Tuesday of every month, riding a gray mare down out of the hills where the boundary line ran between the reservation and everything the government still called open country, though nobody who lived on either side of that line believed the word open meant what it used to. She'd bring deer meat, sometimes rabbit, once a fine set of fox pelts that I still have folded in a trunk I don't open much anymore. And she'd trade for flour, salt, thread, coffee when I had it, and she'd never once haggled harder than the goods were worth. If she left my counter with an extra measure of anything, it was because I'd weighed it wrong on purpose, and she'd caught me at it every single time and set the extra back down without a word. I'd buried my wife Sarah 3 years before Kaya first rode down to my post, and I'd told myself in the months after that I was done needing anything from anyone that couldn't be measured on a scale and settled across a counter. If I left by evening without spoken to another living soul beyond what the day's trade required, I counted that as a fair day. That was the shape of my life when Kaya started coming, and I couldn't have told you that first Tuesday that a woman with a single braid and a stack of deer hides was about to become the reason I started paying attention to Tuesdays again. The mare she rode was a steady gray with a dark mane, sure-footed on the rocky trail down from the hills, and I came to know the particular rhythm of its hooves on the hard-packed road before I ever let myself admit I was listening for it. She always tied it at the same post on the shaded side of the building, and she always checked its girth twice before walking inside, a habit I noticed the way a person notices small things about someone they haven't yet decided to pay attention to on purpose. The trading post sat at the edge of a dusty crossroads town in southern New Mexico territory, close enough to the reservation boundary that half my trade came from settlers heading west and the other half came from families on the reservation side who needed goods the government agency either didn't supply or supplied too late and too little. The reservation system ran on rations distributed on a fixed schedule out of the agency office, beef and flour mostly, and when those rations ran short, which they did more often than the government cared to admit, families made up the difference however they could, which for Kaya meant hunting and trapping across land her people had known for generations, land that a line on a federal map now called something other than theirs. She never spoke of the boundary line with bitterness in front of me, not in those early months. She simply worked around it, the way a person works around weather, because there wasn't much use complaining about a thing that wasn't going to move for your complaining. The post itself was a low adobe building with a single front room lined in shelves, flour and cornmeal in sacks along one wall, coffee and sugar behind the counter where I kept an eye on them, boats of calico and gingham stacked near the door for the ranch wives who came through twice a month, and a scale that had belonged to the man I'd bought the post from, its brass pans worn smooth from 20 years of measuring other people's need against what they could afford to trade for it. I'd learned the business the hard way after Sarah died, when the quiet of an empty house had driven me to spend most of my waking hours behind that counter instead, and I'd grown almost fond of the post's particular rhythms, the rush of trade on ration days when families came through needing to stretch what the agency gave them, the long, slow afternoons when nobody came at all, and I could hear my own thoughts too clearly for comfort. If she stopped coming to trade, I would lose more than deer meat and fox pelts, though it took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand that the loss I feared had nothing to do with what crossed my counter. The stakes of it crept up on me slow, the way most true things do, until one Tuesday in early autumn when a hard rain kept her from making the ride, and I found myself standing at the window past closing, watching the road for a rider who wasn't coming, and understanding with something close to alarm how much of my week had come to depend on a single afternoon I'd never once acknowledged mattering. I started leaving small things by the door of the low adobe house she and her brother kept near the boundary line. A folded wool blanket the first time, left there wordlessly after I'd heard from a passing rancher that an early frost had come hard through the hills. A tin of salt the next month, more than she'd have traded fair goods for, set on her step before dawn so she wouldn't catch me at it. I never left a note. I told myself the gestures asked for nothing in return, and mostly that was true, though if I'm honest, there was a part of me hoping she'd understand what I couldn't yet say plainly. The road up to the boundary line ran maybe 6 miles through country that changed character the closer it got. Open range giving way to pinyon and juniper scrub, the ground rising into low hills where her family's wickiup sat in a shallow draw near a spring that never fully dried, even in the worst of summer. I rode that road at first light more times than I ever told anyone, leaving before the post opened, back before most of the town had finished breakfast, and I told myself each time that I was simply a man being neighborly, the kind of small kindness any decent person might extend, though I knew even then that decent kindness didn't usually require a man to time his errands so carefully around not being seen doing them. Her brother Elin didn't trust me from the first time he rode down with her instead of letting her come alone, which happened more often once the blanket started this quiet correspondence neither of us named. He was 19, sharp-eyed, carrying the particular wariness of a young man who'd watched his people lose more to well-meaning settlers than to outright enemies, and he made no effort to hide his opinion of a trading post owner leaving gifts at her sister's door like a man laying claim to something. He told her, once, within earshot of me, though I don't think he cared whether I heard it, that soft words from a white man's mouth had a way of turning hard the moment it cost him to keep them soft. Kaya didn't answer him in front of me, but I saw something pass across her face that told me the words had landed somewhere old, some wound that predated me by a good deal more than a season. Elin had been 12 when their father died, old enough to remember the promises that came apart and too young to do anything about it, and he'd grown into the kind of watchfulness that never fully rested, the way a person stays braced for weather that has already proven it can turn without warning. He worked what land the family had been allotted near the boundary, ran a small string of horses he traded and broke for extra goods, and treated every settler who came near his sister with the same careful, unsmiling appraisal, as though measuring how much damage a man was capable of before deciding how much rope to give him. I understood his caution, even when it stung, because I'd have wanted the same thing watching over Sarah if Sarah had ever needed watching over the way Kaya sometimes did in a country that hadn't decided yet whether she was owed the same protections as anyone else living within its borders. The wound, when I finally understood the shape of it, went back to a promise a government agent had made her father years before. A promise of seed corn and farming equipment in exchange for the family settling permanently on assigned land near the agency. A promise that had come apart within 2 seasons when the equipment never arrived and the seed corn turned out to be spoiled in half the sacks. Her father had died the following winter, weakened by a hard season and a broken promise both, and Kaya had learned early that a settler's kindness could be sincere in the moment and worthless within a year, and that the two things weren't even contradictions, just 2 faces of the same unreliable coin. She told me this slowly, over the better part of a year, a piece at a time, the way a person shares something only after they've watched you long enough to trust the sharing wouldn't be wasted. She told me, too, about the ration days at the agency office, how families lined up with tickets stamped by a clerk who rarely looked up from his ledger, trading dignity for beef that sometimes arrived and sometimes didn't, depending on contracts signed by men who'd never once set foot on the land whose people they were provisioning. She said her family hunted and trapped not out of some old stubborn pride, but out of plain necessity, because a ration ticket wasn't a thing you could feed a family on when the wagon carrying the promised beef simply failed to show, which happened more seasons than the government's own reports ever seemed to reflect. The first emotional peak of whatever was happening between us came on a Tuesday in the second spring, when she stayed past the usual length of a trade for the first time, sitting on the low bench outside my post while her mare drank from the trough, and we talked, really talked, past the counting of goods and the plain courtesies for the better part of an hour. She told me the mission school run near the agency taught her English before she'd turned 12, alongside lessons meant to make her and every other child there into something other than what they'd been raised to be, and that she'd kept the language and quietly discarded most of the rest, the way a person keeps a useful tool and sets aside the box it came in. She said it without self-pity, just as plain fact, the same tone I'd use to tell someone the price of flour. I found myself telling her about Sarah for the first time, not the whole of it, just enough, the shape of the grief rather than its every edge, and she listened the way almost no one in that town had bothered to listen to me in 3 years, without rushing to fix it or change the subject to something easier. I told her Sarah had died of a fever the second winter we'd run the post together, quick enough that I hadn't had time to properly understand what was happening before it was over, and that I'd spent the years since telling myself grief was a private business best handled behind a closed door, the way most men out here were taught to handle anything that threatened to show on their face in front of others. Kaya didn't offer the kind of easy comfort people usually reached for. She simply said that grief carried alone tended to calcify into something harder than the original wound, and that she'd watched it happen to more than one person in her own family, and that she was glad, for my sake, that I'd finally said Sarah's name out loud to someone. She turned to look at me on that bench, the afternoon light catching the loose strands that had worked free of her braid, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. I felt something in my chest go still and waiting, the particular held breath feeling of a moment about to become something else entirely. And then Elan rode up fast from the trail, dust rising behind his horse, calling out that agency men were making an unscheduled inspection of the boundary allotments that afternoon, and every family needed to be present and accounted for, or risk losing standing on the land rolls entirely. Kaya was on her mare and gone within a minute, and the moment dissolved into the dust of her leaving before either of us had said a single word of what had been building on that bench. The dark turn came from a place I hadn't expected, though maybe I should have seen it building the whole time. A rancher named Whitcomb who ran cattle on range abutting the reservation boundary and resented every acre of it, was a thorn in the side of that boundary line for longer than I'd owned the post. A man who'd twice petitioned the territorial government to have the reservation's grazing allotment reduced in his favor, and who took every dry season as personal proof that the land belonged rightfully to men willing to fence it and work it the way he understood working land to mean. He came into my post one afternoon in early summer, ostensibly for a sack of cornmeal, and made it plain, in the loud, unhurried way of a man who enjoys an audience, that he didn't care for a trading post owner who left gifts at an Apache woman's door, like a man courting a wife, instead of running an honest business. He said it in front of 2 other customers, and I felt my face go hot with an anger I hadn't let myself feel plainly in years. But before I could answer him, he added something worse: that the agency had been asking questions about goods leaving my post in quantities that didn't match the trade ledger, on account of a complaint he himself had filed, and that a man in my position ought to think hard about which side of the boundary line he wanted to be seen standing on when the agent came asking. It wasn't an idle threat. 2 weeks later, an agency inspector did come, a tired man named Pruitt, with a ledger book and a manner that suggested he'd rather have been anywhere else, sent out from the regional office in response to a written complaint about irregular trade practices along the boundary. He went through my trade records line by line, asking pointed questions about entries where the goods traded didn't quite match the standard rates I charged settlers passing through, questions I answered as honestly as I could while my palms went damp against the counter, despite the cool morning air coming through the open door, aware the whole time that a wrong word chosen carelessly could undo 2 years of careful, quiet work in a single afternoon. Though he found nothing worth prosecuting in the end, my books were sloppy in places but not dishonest. He made it clear in a quiet, official way that continued informal trade with reservation families outside the sanctioned commissary arrangement could cost me my license to operate the post at all, and that a second complaint, however unfounded, would likely trigger a more thorough investigation than he had time or inclination to conduct that day. I understood, sitting across from that inspector with the scale sitting silent between us, that Whitcomb's complaint had been a warning shot aimed less at my business than at whatever he'd guessed was happening between Kaya and me, and that the cost of continuing it plainly might be everything I'd built since Sarah died. I didn't sleep well the nights that followed. I lay awake running the arithmetic of it over and over. The post was the only steady income I had, the only thing standing between me and the kind of drifting poverty that swallowed men out here who lost their footing, and I told myself, in the dark, that caution was simply what a responsible man did when he had something worth protecting. It didn't feel like cowardice while I was telling myself that. It only started feeling like cowardice once I understood what the caution was actually costing. I didn't see Kaya for 3 weeks after that. I told myself it was caution, the sensible thing, a way of protecting the post, and in some tangled way I hadn't examined too closely, protecting her, too, from a complication she hadn't asked for. What it actually was, I came to understand later, was fear dressed up as prudence, the same fear that had kept me from saying anything true to another person since I'd buried Sarah. I stopped leaving things at her door. I told the next family who came through from her camp that I couldn't extend the same informal trade arrangements going forward without ever explaining why, and word of that reached her within days, the way word travels in a place where everyone depends on the same handful of roads. She came to the post herself on the 4th Tuesday, alone, no deer meat or pelts, just her and the mare, and a directness in her face I hadn't seen from her before. She asked me plainly whether Whitcomb's talk had scared me off, and I understood I had a choice standing at that counter, to give her some careful, half-true answer that protected my pride, or to tell her the whole of it. I told her the whole of it. I told her about the inspector, about the threat to my license, about 3 weeks of telling myself I was being responsible when really I was being afraid. Afraid of losing the post, afraid of what the town would say, and underneath both of those, afraid of caring about someone enough that losing them again might undo whatever careful, guarded peace I'd rebuilt since Sarah. She was quiet a long moment after I finished. Then she told me something that changed how I understood everything since the mission school and her father's broken promise. She said she hadn't come to my post these 2 years looking for a man who'd never disappoint her, because she'd learned young that everyone disappoints somebody eventually, settler and Apache alike. And the measure of a person wasn't whether they'd fail you, but whether they came back and said so plainly when they did. She said my silence these 3 weeks had hurt worse than any ledger inspection could have, because silence was the one thing her father's broken promises and every careful, unkept kindness since had taught her to expect from people who claimed to care. She said Elon had told her when word reached them that I'd stopped extending trade, that he'd expected exactly this all along, and that the hardest part of the last 3 weeks hadn't been proving him right so much as realizing how badly she'd wanted him to be wrong. I stood there behind my own counter, the scale between us, and understood that I'd managed to become the very thing I'd spent 2 years trying to prove I wasn't. The turning point wasn't a grand gesture. It was smaller than that, and truer for its smallness. I closed the post early the following Tuesday, hung a hand-lettered sign in the window that said simply, "Back tomorrow," something I hadn't done since Sarah's funeral, and rode up to the boundary line myself, past the point where I usually let her come to me. I found her and Elin repairing a section of their wiki-up frame after a storm had torn loose part of the bent willow structure. Work that fell mostly to the women of her family by tradition, since building and maintaining the dwelling was understood among her people as a skill and responsibility passed down through the women of a household, though Elin was helping with the heavier poles that needed more than one set of hands to bend and lash into place. Kaya looked up when she heard my horse, and for a moment her face gave away nothing at all, which frightened me more than anger would have. I didn't say much once I'd dismounted. I picked up a length of willow lying nearby and started working alongside them without asking permission first, matching the rhythm of how Elin was bending and lashing the poles, my hands clumsy at first against work I'd never done. Elin watched me a long while, saying nothing, before he handed me a second pole without a word, which from him was as close to acceptance as I was likely to get that day. And it was enough to keep my hands busy while I found the courage to say what I'd actually ridden up there to say. Kaya and I talked properly that evening, sitting outside the finished wiki-up as the light went long and gold across the hills, and I told her I didn't have a clean answer for what came next. That the boundary line wasn't going to move because two people on either side of it had decided they cared for each other. That Whitcomb would keep talking. That the agency would keep watching. That none of it would be simple. She said she'd never once expected simple. She said what she'd wanted, all along, wasn't a promise that nothing hard would come, but a person who'd stay through the hard part and tell her the truth about it as it happened, instead of vanishing into silence the moment it cost something. I told her that was a thing I could actually promise, the first honest promise I'd made to anyone since I'd stood at Sarah's grave and privately sworn off ever needing anyone again. We sat a long while after that, past the point where the light had gone from gold to the deep blue that comes just before full dark, and she told me more about her father than she'd ever told me before. Not just the broken promise that had cost him his health, but the man himself, how he'd taught her to read a deer's trail from a broken twig no wider than a finger, how he'd sung a particular song to the horses each morning that she still caught herself humming sometimes without meaning to. She said grief, when it wasn't buried under silence, could turn into something closer to company than sorrow, and that she hoped I might learn to speak of Sarah that same way someday, not as a wound kept behind a closed door, but as a person who'd simply walked ahead of me down a road I was still traveling. I hadn't expected comfort to arrive in exactly that shape, but it did. Sitting there in the dark with the wiki-up frame newly repaired behind us and Elan's fire crackling low a short distance off, the stars coming out slow overhead the way they always did out there, indifferent and steady both at once. The resolution didn't arrive as a single dramatic moment, the way stories sometimes tell it. It arrived the way most real things do, in small accumulating proofs. I kept the informal trade going, but I did it properly this time, spending 2 long evenings with a borrowed accounting book working out a system that recorded every exchange at a fair, defensible rate, so that if Pruitt or anyone like him ever came asking again, there would be nothing left to question. It was slower, less generous in the small ways I'd once allowed myself, but it was honest in a way that could withstand scrutiny. And I found I didn't mind the extra work half as much as I'd expected, careful about the ledger now in ways I hadn't bothered to be before, protecting both the post and the families who depended on it. Whitcomb kept talking around town, and some of that talk cost me customers who preferred not to be seen at a post that traded plainly and fairly across the boundary line, and there was a stretch that autumn when I genuinely wondered whether the post could survive the loss of trade his gossip caused. But a strange thing happened as the months wore on. A handful of settlers who'd always dealt fairly with me started dealing more, quietly, as though choosing sides without ever announcing it. And a family from the reservation side that had never traded with me before came down specifically because word had reached them that my post could be trusted to weigh things honestly, boundary line or no boundary line. It wasn't enough to make me rich, it was enough that the business held, and some nights that felt like more of a victory than it had any right to. Ilan never became a man who trusted easily, but he stopped watching me like a threat and started watching me like a slow, grudging fact he'd decided to accept. There was a morning that winter when he showed up at the post alone, without Kaya, leading a young horse he'd been breaking, and he asked, gruffly and without looking at me directly, whether I wanted to see what he'd taught it. It wasn't friendship, not yet, maybe not ever in the way that word usually means, but it was an opening, offered on his own terms, in his own time, and I understood better to rush it or make more of it than it was. We stood by the corral fence for the better part of an hour while he put the horse through its paces, and neither of us said much of anything, and it was one of the better mornings I'd had in years. Though we never spoke of Kaya once the entire time, both of us understanding without saying so that some things were better let alone until they were ready to be spoken of plainly on their own schedule by the people they most concerned. And Kaya kept coming on Tuesdays, though somewhere in that second autumn the visits stopped being about deer meat and flour and became simply about the two of us sitting on the bench outside my post as the light went long, talking about whatever the week had brought, no longer counting the minutes against a trade that had already been made and settled long before either of us said so out loud. By the following spring, she was staying past dusk more often than not, and I'd taken to keeping a second lantern lit on the bench for exactly that reason, though I never said so plainly, and she never asked why a trading post owner needed 2 lanterns burning after closing on a Tuesday evening when the accounts had already been settled an hour before. The town noticed, the way small towns always notice everything eventually, and most of what they said behind my back I never heard directly, though enough of it reached me second-hand to know that not everyone had come around the way Elon slowly had, some of it unkind in ways I chose not to repeat even to myself, some of it merely curious in the way small towns are curious about anything that doesn't fit neatly into the shape they're used to. I stopped minding as much as I once might have. There's a particular freedom in caring more about one true thing than about the good opinion of people who'd never once bothered to learn Kaya's name before deciding what to think of her, and I found that freedom sometime that second year, quietly, without ever announcing it to anyone but myself. She never wore her hair any differently than that single braid. Not for me, not for the town, not for anyone. I asked her once, early on, if there was a reason behind it, some meaning I ought to understand, half expecting some old custom I'd never heard of, the kind of story a curious outsider likes to be told. She only laughed, a short, surprised sound I didn't hear often from her, and said it was simply the way she'd always worn it, the way her mother had taught her before she was old enough to remember learning it, and that she saw no cause to change herself into something easier for other people to look at, not for the mission school, not for the agency clerks who'd once suggested she'd be treated better, dressed and groomed to look less like where she came from, and certainly not for a trading post owner who'd taken 2 years to work up the nerve to ask a simple question about her hair. I think I loved her most clearly in that answer, though I didn't have the word for it yet. It came to me properly, that word, on an ordinary Tuesday, nearly 2 years after the first one, when she rode down the trail in a light rain that had turned the road to soft red mud, and instead of hurrying inside out of the wet the way most people would, she paused at the hitching post to check the mare's girth twice, same as always, unbothered by the rain soaking through her shawl, and I stood in the doorway watching her do that small, familiar, unhurried thing, and understood all at once that I had built my whole week, without ever deciding to, around the certainty of her doing exactly that. It wasn't a grand realization, nothing that arrived with any fanfare. It simply settled into place the way true things tend to, quiet and complete. And I remember thinking that if this was what the word meant, then I'd apparently been living inside it for longer than I'd had the sense to notice. She never cut it, and she never asked me to change anything about myself either. Not the careful, unhurried way I talked, not the habits I'd built up over 3 years of grieving alone, not even the plain, unremarkable fact of who I'd been before I'd ever learned to notice the sound of a gray mare's hooves on a dirt road. There was a kind of grace in that I hadn't expected from anyone, let alone from someone who'd had every reason, given by every settler she'd ever known before me, to expect that being accepted meant being changed first, reshaped into something more palatable, before it could be called love at all. And somewhere in the space that made between us, in all the small, unhurried Tuesdays that stopped being about trade and started being about simply choosing again and again to show up honestly for each other, we built something neither the boundary line nor the whole watching town could quite manage to unmake. Years from now, if anyone ever asks me how it started, I won't have a tidy answer. I'll say it started with a braid I noticed and never asked about, and a scale I weighed wrong on purpose more times than I ever admitted, and a road 6 miles long that I rode before dawn so many times I could have walked it blind by the end. I'll say it started the way most true things start, which is to say quietly, without either person quite agreeing to it out loud, until one day there was simply no version of the week that didn't have her in it, no version of the post that felt complete without the particular sound of a gray mare's hooves on the road outside, no version of myself I could imagine now that didn't include the 2 years it took to earn her trust honestly, one Tuesday at a time. She never said she'd chosen to stay, not in so many words, not in a way a person could point to and call a promise. She simply kept riding down every Tuesday, long after either of us had any reason left to pretend it was about the trade.